Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 33, chapter 33, entitled, You Are One with Two Hands. Midori stood in the crowded arena with a full stomach, having parted from Gami on his way here. Maybe scarfing down rice and beef teriyaki right before he probably had to overexert himself wasn't a good idea, but it wasn't like he had much of a choice. Gami wouldn't have let him skip it, even if he wanted to, which was probably for the better anyway. "All right," Present Mike announced, refreshed from the lunch break. "Let's get started." The screen flickered to life. A blank tournament bracket was loading in for all to see. At the sight, his heart flickered too, fingertips tingling from underneath their gloved prisons. "Between the 16 members of the 4 teams, we'll have a formal tournament." He looked around, spotting Tokiyami and Dark Shadow, talking together, maybe discussing a strategy. His heartstrings snapped from inside him. He kind of missed that. He missed the constant support that came from his mentor, the companionship during rough and bloody times, the warmth that came from his undead touch. Gami was the pillar that he leaned on, and despite his attempt to mature by essentially leaving him in the comfort of home, maybe that wasn't what he needed. He'd be around for at least 100 years. Gami would be too, as long as he chose not to move on. He'd never be alone. So why was he trying to be? "Get ready for a series of one-on-one battles." He shook his head. Having Gami's help now wouldn't really be fair, not against his other classmates, who were giving it their all. So he pushed back, the leech of a thought aside for now. Though he was certain that he'd have to address it eventually. He should have known this by now. His track record for putting things off and not having regrets was practically non-existent. Midnight then strutted to the edge of the stage, rattling a box in her hand that looked oddly familiar to the one All Might used during the battle training exercise. "The matchups will be decided by drawing lots," she clarified, holding the box next to her sly smile. "Once that's settled, we'll move on to the recreational activities, and then the tournament itself." So he'd have to rely on fate then. Well, he had a pretty fair idea of how that usually went. "Finalists, it's up to you whether or not you participate in the recreational events. I expect some of you would rather take a breather and save your strength." Midnight sauntered over to the descending stairs that led off to the stage. Excuse me." Everyone stopped and turned to the voice, whose owner meekly stood from within the crowd with a raised hand and a coiled tail. "I'd like to drop out." The rest of their classmates bursted into confusion. Chatter erupted from the masses as everyone, including Midoriya, tried to figure out why Oshiro would possibly not want to compete. This was their chance to be seen by pros, to leap toward the future, so why? What would possibly make him want to give that up? "I have no memories of anything that happened during the cavalry battle until the very end." Oshiro lowered his hand, and then he mumbled under his breath. It's probably his quirk that did it. Midori looked around. Oshiro obviously wasn't on his team for the cavalry battle, nor was he on Todoroki's team. He was pretty sure he wasn't on Bakugo's team either, so that only left one more. Shinsou, if he remembered the name correctly, though it wasn't one he recognized. He was certainly not a Class A student, maybe a Class B. He wasn't sure. He followed Oshiro's stare, hoping that it would help him out in his deduction. His eyes met, with a familiar head of electrified purple hair and a zombie-ish complexion, and his own head groaned. Just his luck. "I know this is a great opportunity. And I know how stupid it is to seem to throw it away." Midori couldn't help the pity he felt for his classmate because he knew the feeling exactly. Gami could attest. He'd done what seemed like stupider things for the sake of his own damned pride. But this final tournament, everyone else made it here by their own strength, yet I don't even know how or why. I just can't take it. Some other classmates tried to convince him to compete anyways, but as soon as Midori saw that look in his eye, he knew there was no convincing him. Though, as soon as Oshiro brought his hand up to cover his face, he felt that signature snap that only heartstrings could make. "I'm talking about my pride here. I don't think it's right." But just because he knew how it felt didn't make him any more numb. "I can't remember anything either." Another student piped up. Midori didn't recognize him either. He couldn't tell if he was a Class B or General Studies. "I want to withdraw too." Murmurs flooded the crowd as the teachers spoke amongst themselves, trying to decide whether or not withdrawal was valid. "How naive," Midnight huffed under her breath. "I like it." and with a crack of her whip, the two names were removed from the screen. The arena erupted into semi-chaos as two replacements were determined, but Midoriya wasn't all too concerned with that. He was too busy trying to counter-strategize for his worst potential matchups. Kaminari would be a problem, definitely. He couldn't exactly do much if he decided to let out 1,000,000 volts at once, and despite his tendency to use brute force and push his way through pain, he wasn't sure he could will his body to withstand all that electricity if he wanted to. His best possible way to win would be to incapacitate him before he got shocked, but even then he wasn't sure he'd be able to be fast enough. It didn't take long, exactly, for Kaminari to release all that electricity. Now that he thought about it, he paired well against physical quirks. Yaoyorozu would probably be an easy win, since he could destroy anything that she created. Hatsume, too, though he'd feel especially bad if he had to do that to her inventions after everything. Sero wouldn't be too bad to go against either, unless he managed to get really caught up in all that tape. Even Todoroki, as long as he only used his ice. Uraraka, he could best in hand-to-hand combat as long as he avoided being touched by her, which was probably harder than he was making it out to be. Ida's speed would play against him hard. There wasn't much he could do offensively in a setting that wasn't life or death, considering he didn't want to cause any permanent harm. He would again have to try to incapacitate him if it came down to it, which would definitely be tricky. Ashido had her acid, but he could use brute force and push his way through that. Aoyama wouldn't pose much of a challenge, if he was being honest. Tokiyami might be tricky, Dark Shadow was solid, so he could theoretically use DT if he wanted to, but he refused to even take that risk. He could cut straight through the bird with his blade, but that would also be risking the same as before. He'd have to try and incapacitate him, which wouldn't be easy in a 2-against-1. Kirishima would be difficult for the same reason as Ida and Tokiyami. He couldn't do much against him without seriously hurting him, and, unlike Ashido, he couldn't brute force his way through the fight. With his hardening quirk, Kirishima would easily outlast him. And Bakugo was, well, Bakugo. And here are the matchups. Oh, well, here was the moment of truth. He peered up at the screen and... Shinsou? He gasped out loud. Of course it had to be him, on top of his match of being first overall. Just his luck, typical, really. But on the bright side, if it could be called that, his second match was against Todoroki. If he could get there, then maybe he could help. How? Well, he was still working out that part of his plan. Midoriya Izuku, that's you, right? An ice-cold shiver went down his spine, as he could just make out that mess of purple hair that creeped up from behind him. But before he could even think about responding, something wrapped itself around his face, preventing him from speaking, something firm and rugged, yet slightly fluffy. Midoriya! Ojiro yelled. His tail had curled lightly around the other's face. That guy. Don't answer him. Shinsou huffed under his breath, smirking sarcastically before finally walking away, though not without a glint of detest in his eyes. Upon losing him in the crowd, Midoriya gently lowered Ojiro's tail. Don't answer him, huh? It seemed like Gami's paranoia had some merit after all. Guess he'd have to admit to the ghost that he was right. Again. Ojiro walked up beside him. I want to talk. Meet me in the ready room after this. That seemed to be the idea today. Regardless, he nodded silently, then watched it as Ojiro turned to disappear into the crowd. Now, let's set the tournament aside for the time being and go on with the festivities. As much as he wanted to stay and mess around with some of his friends, he headed toward the arena exit to find the ready room. It would have been fun for sure, but maybe another time. Next year if he was lucky. After all, there were things greater than himself. He slinked through the hallways like before, hoping this time he'd actually be able to remain undetected. There was less people out and about than he had expected, but he guessed most students wanted a chance to de-stress. They were just kids after all. Heroes in training, but kids in the end. There you are. I do hope that it's all right for us to hang out before your match. Gami stopped abruptly. You look sad. Is something wrong? Midori wasn't even startled by his mentor's appearance this time. He just waved a hand off to the side dismissively. It's nothing, really. Just thinking too much. The ghost pondered for a moment. So, what are you doing inside? I found a good place for viewing among the Class A stands, but it's terribly awful when it comes to hearing anything other than what comes across the speakers. Ojiro wanted to talk to me before my match. I've got a good feeling that it has something to do with Shinsou's quirk. He rolled his eyes upon remembering the other thing. You're probably right about his quirk being verbally responsive. Gami nudged him playfully. What if I always told you? The teen sneered teasingly. Oh, I don't know. You've said a lot of things, Mr. I've been mature for 5 centuries. What? It is true. But he wasn't being serious in the slightest. In fact, they both bursted into laughter at their stupidly immature antics, and neither would have it any other way. His thoughts from earlier resurfaced, remembering the dynamic Tokiyami and Dark Shadow had, but he pushed them aside. There were greater things to focus on right now that could come later. Ah, right here. He pointed toward a door, the sign next to it reading 1A Ready Room. He couldn't see through the tempered glass, but he slid the door open anyways. Sure enough, Ojiro sat by one of the tables, and upon his appearance beckoned him to sit next to him. So Midori wiggled his way past straight chairs and promptly sat down, sensing the serious tone by his classmate's expression. Gami floated alongside him, passing straight through the tables and chairs, lucky enough that his temperamental solidity didn't snag on something. Ojiro cut straight to the chase. You're at a greater disadvantage than I think you realize. I'm almost certain that Shinsou was a mind control quirk. Midori was caught off guard. A mind control quirk? There has to be some sort of gimmick. My loss might be your gain. My memories cut out the instant I replied to him. Ojiro tapped his head in thought. That's the trick, I think. He couldn't help but shudder. That was still a powerful ability, so what was he doing in general studies? That kind of quirk would end fights almost instantly. There'd be much less property damage, physical injuries, deaths. With that kind of power, he should be in the hero course, though I presume the nature of the entrance exam stopped him from being accepted. Right. The physical portion of the exam was against faux villains, mechanical robots. If a verbal response was truly Shinsou's trigger, then there was nothing he could do against enemies who didn't respond. An unfortunate coincidence, one might call it. Midori rested his head in his hands. So if I slip up and respond, it's all over. But Ojiro shook his head. Not necessarily. It doesn't seem like it's an almighty ability. His classmate had looked off to the side, waving a finger as he recalled the event before. I didn't remember anything up until the end of the cavalry battle. When Shinsou had us run past a Class B formation to nab their headbands, I think I must have bumped into their formation. He then turned back to meet Midoriya's intrigued gaze. That's when I snapped out of it. I was suddenly aware of what was happening. He hummed in his own thoughts. So it was undone by physical contact? Ojiro nodded. That seems pretty likely, though I wouldn't rely on it. His classmate leaned back in his chair, a nice long creak echoing around the empty room. That said, I have no idea how strong the contact needs to be. Ojiro sighed. And in a one-on-one match, of course, you can't expect any outside help. At that, Gami gave a look that he knew all too well, but he shut it down with his own. If he was going to get caught by Shinsou's quirk, then the other deserved the win. And if he was going to break out of his control, then it would be of his own volition, and his alone. However impossible that might be, it was only fair to extend his morals to the other, considering how he'd been played by the system once already. He was shaken back into focus by the piercing screech of a metal chair sliding against the floor. He looked up to see Ojiro standing, pushing his chair in with his tail. Anyway, that's about as much as I could gather. No, this is great, thanks, he stressed, sending out a smile. Ojiro turned to leave, but hesitated for a moment, looking down at his hand. Forgive me if I'm out of line, but... He raised a hand up toward Midoriya, curling it into a fist. Win this one for me. He stood there, a bit caught off guard, before standing up himself, and he curled his own gloved hand and bumped it slightly with Ojiro's, this time a more resolved expression meeting his lips. I will. All right. Will the contestants of our first match please make their way to the arena? Gami nudged him lightly. That is your cue. Midoriya nodded. I should get going. He made his way to the door, sliding it open and stepping out of the ready room. Good luck. He flashed a thumbs up before sliding closed the door. The teen walked the empty halls. By now everyone had already taken their place in the stands, and while before he would have relished in the relative peace, now it unnerved him. The silence left him anxious and fidgety, as the weight of what was about to happen had hit him like a truck. Hey. He turned around, away from the light that was shining from the tunnel that led to the arena. His eyes met shadowy darkness, with one special shadow that stood out from the rest. I do realize there is much to think about currently, much more than anyone should have to worry about at a time like this. Midoriya swallowed to try and relieve his dry throat. He huffed to try and calm his racing heart. He stiffened to try and still his shaking hands. But do remember at the end of the day that you are only expected to do what is human. He raised out a hand, letting the sleeve roll down to reveal skeletal fingers. However we may look, that is all we are. His words drilled deep into his skull. He wanted to believe that he really did. But what was he supposed to do when the world was far bigger than himself? When everything he did was inevitably far bigger than himself? He had to at least try. However today goes, I am always very proud of you. He ruffled the other's hair, stirring it into a mess. Good luck indeed, and do kick ass. He swatted his mentor's hand away playfully at that last part. You're enjoying that way too much. Kami began floating off, but not without uttering a rare and low laugh. Maybe so, he chuckled under his breath. Maybe so. And with that the ghost was gone once more, leaving him with dying embers of warmth. There was much he had to do, and despite his immortality, so little time to do it, he knew he couldn't do it all, as much as he willed himself to do so, but he had to at least try. He had to. For Todoroki, for Kiori and his brother, he stepped out into the light as thousands of eyes stared down at him, and for everyone else along the way. Wowing us with his crafty and excellent performance so far, it's Midori Izuku from the Hero Course. He cracked his knuckles fiercely, feeling slightly more confident as he did. Versus! Another silhouette began to emerge from the other tunnel. Sneaking through round after round, he hasn't been stopped yet. It's Shinsou Itoshi from General Studies. They met in the center of the arena, staring each other down like an old country standoff. Midori thought about it for a moment, but ultimately he had decided to remove one of his gloves and stuff it into his back pocket like before. He wasn't planning on having to use DT against anyone in these one-on-ones, but it hadn't hurt him yet. The rules are simple, Present Mike continued. Win by knocking out your opponent in the ring, immobilizing them, or getting them to surrender. His fingertips buzzed in anticipation, and he exhaled deeply to try and calm the power flooding his veins. It was almost as if the power was growing too strong to bear, but he knew that wasn't the case. His abilities were finite. Unlike quirks, which could mutate and evolve across their lifespan, his DT couldn't get any stronger than it already was. Bring on the pain! We've got good old Recovery Girl on standby. He'd just been relying on it more often than he'd ever hoped to. And after suppressing his decay for most of his life, it was only natural that it became stir-crazy under his skin, and after getting himself into this life of heroism, there was no way he could go back to normal. So he'd have to learn to live with this new normal, to move with it, to fight with it, to live in it. He could no longer continue hiding behind his fear. And fight dirty if you must. Ethics have no meaning here. He looked down at his bare palm, nothing but pale skin staring back, and yet he could practically see the death that emanated from it. He needed to learn. He needed to embrace. But of course, going for the kill is a no-no. You'll be disqualified. But he couldn't stop the shiver that came from the thought. Get it, Midori Izuku? He looked up. That wasn't Present Mike, and by the smirk on Shinsou's face, he couldn't be sure it wasn't. This battle's going to be the test of strength of your will. His tired eyes lolled to the side, and yet he wasn't any less intimidated. Because a true hero's fists only fly when in pursuit of villains. And then Shinsou sneered at him. Not that you have any. What can you even do? He shook his head, trying to dislodge the thought. Not now, he couldn't do this right now. Someone like you? Huh, Shinsou mocked. What's someone like you doing here? Why is someone like you trying to become a hero? He pinched his fingers together, digging his nails into the skin. The pain cleared some of the fog in his head, and in that brief moment of clarity, he scrambled to find some other stimuli to latch onto. Now, let's get this thing started. Shit, they haven't even started yet? Taking the space from someone else that should have been here instead. Just hope for a quirk in your next life and go take a swan dive off the roof. He gnashed his teeth into flesh of his mouth and was hoping that the metallic spark of blood would snap him of the fog that he was suffocating in. He thought that he'd moved on. He thought that he was better than their words. So why? Why did they all still have so much control over him? Why did they hurt so much? Ready? You're a disgrace, Shinsou pressed, to every sense of the word hero. You need to be realistic. Stop. Start! Midori moved to step forward, but his first step faltered. And that's when Shinsou knew he had him right where he wanted him. Talking to yourself like you're crazy. Huh, so now the hero course is talking to themselves? Stop! He lunged forward, taking a wild swing at the other, an untactful maneuver that was completely unlike him. Shinsou was easily able to dodge. Just shut up. Using your quirk so recklessly, like you'll never hurt anyone. You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. Shut up. Shut up. Midoriya continued aggressively. He just wanted them to stop. He'd proved them wrong. He'd shown them that he was capable of helping people, of saving people. Why couldn't he just shut them up after everything? Shinsou ducked under another swing, though this time he was nearly tripped over his own feet. Still, he knew he was oh so close. What are you doing here, pretending? Did you really think that someone like you could be anything close to heroes like them? Why do you keep going when no one's here to save you? Just shut up! And suddenly he felt like any sort of control he had left and slipped away as his entire body froze up. What? President Mike exclaimed over the speakers. Just seconds into the match and Midoriya's frozen in place? The teen fought against himself, urging his body to move, but something kept unnaturally keeping him locked in place, forcing him to just be behind his skin. He was trapped within the shell that was himself, and yet his eyes remained cruelly locked on Shinsou. Sorry, but he was forced to watch as the other smugly leaned back. It's my win. His soul struggled within its prison, but he was just banging on his own bones. His instincts thought that he was in danger, and every nerve flared into chaos as adrenaline rushed him, but it had nowhere to escape, and instead it simmered beneath his skin just as he did, the buzz painfully apparent. It must be nice to have everything handed to you, Midoriya Izuku. Even from his stance of victory, Shinsou still had to dig into him, and for that, Midoriya thrashed from inside of his anger and agony. He tried so desperately to speak, but his lips were sealed shut. He had no mouth, but he still screamed. Now turn around and walk out of the ring. And now he fought to keep himself still, as his body turned against his will. His steps were slow and heavy, like he was dragging himself through the mud, but they were far from his own. The feeling was alien, his consciousness bashing against the walls of his skull. He needed to escape. He needed to escape, but his body wouldn't listen. His head was far too fuzzy. He was trapped. 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 After everything, after Ojiro had gone through the trouble to warn him, he'd thrown it all away, and for what? To argue against a voice that he knew was wrong? To argue against a voice that he'd disproved time after time? To argue against a voice that sounded so right? His anger simmered into sadness, step after step. What a fool he was. After everything everyone had done for him, he disappointed them anyways. The people that cared enough to help him, he'd let them down, like he always had. He guessed this was fair. He knew in his heart that if he still managed to get caught in Shinsou's quirk after the advantage he was given, that then his pitiful loss was only fair. He just wasn't good enough. Even after everything, he never was. Besides that, in all honesty, I am so proud of you. I am proud to have known you for every piece of who you are. No. Forgive me if I'm out of line, but win this one for me. Not like this. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Maybe, as I said it aloud, I was hoping that it would make sense to me, but now I've lost myself completely. He just couldn't give up like this. Despite how pitiful he was, there were people that cared enough to help him, to show him that he had worth in his unforgiving world. Everyone had done so much for him, and he'd promised to help others in return, to give back what was so graciously given to him. He couldn't help anyone if this was all it took to give up. As he stepped closer to the edge of the arena, that fire from before exploded inside of him. He bursted with newfound drive, his fight returning to him. He would never give up, never again. He would fight, and even as his body fell apart on him, he would continue. That was the nature of his existence. If he was going to be forced to roam this earth for 100 years, he might as well do it fighting. He would fight until the very end and then beyond. The adrenaline returned tenfold as he gave into the instincts. Yes, he was in danger of failing people that had worked so hard for him, and while it was his fault for getting caught in Shinsou's quirk, he had sworn that if he was going to break out of his control, then it would be of his own volition and his alone, however impossible that may be. His veins buzzed painfully, as they typically did when he was piped up on power, but this time it was as if his whole body was burning. He guessed this was how his DT felt at the edge of his fingertips with no escape, an agonizing experience, really. He was truly trapped within his own skin, a prison of his own flesh and blood. He was only a few steps away from the arena edge now, but despite his fire, he still couldn't break from this puppeteering grasp. His fingers seared with power. He could feel the overwhelming rush of DT right there, just begging to be released, but he couldn't actively touch anything in this state. Nothing except for the air around him. He'd told himself he wasn't going to try and experiment with his small explosions during the sports festival because he was seriously afraid his lack of experience would hurt someone, and yet he had already broken that promise unintentionally, using one during the cavalry battle against Todoroki's fire. It had come out so naturally, amidst his desperation and determination, just as it had the first time against Shigaraki. His body had only been trying to protect him, fueled by his own fearful adrenaline. He had to stop being afraid of himself. He had to take control of what he was gifted with. Midori pushed his power violently into his hands, straight to his fingertips where he knew it couldn't escape. He could feel the pressure building painfully, but he continued, remembering just how he felt before, that desperation, that fear, that overwhelming desire to do something. His hands throbbed like they were going to explode. Come on. Come on. He raised his foot just before the out-of-bounds line. Please! A deafening explosion ran out, and it was knocking Midori off his feet and away from the arena's edge. Midoriya! He's stopped moving! He panted amongst the heavy dust that was kicked up, heaving out his suffocating lungs. Spit flew from his exhausted gasps, sweat trickling off his chin, his heart hammering from within his chest, stuttering like he had come back to life, and in a way, he had. He was free. He stood up shakily, turning to see the flabbergasted look on Shinsou's face. How? He cried, utterly shocked. You shouldn't have control. What did you do? He gripped the one uncovered hand that had emitted the explosion, cradling it with his gloved one. They both burned excruciatingly, one from aftershocks of the blast and the other from pent-up power still contained. Shinsou was right. He shouldn't have had control, but he did. He got especially lucky, as it seemed like he always had. But he couldn't stay like this forever. He had to learn control and abandon fear. He was going to. But do remember, at the end of the day, you are only expected to do what is human. He promised. Nothing to say for yourself? The other grimaced. Midori remained silent, sealing his lips of his own accord this time. He hung back, trying to squeeze in those last few breaths and brute force through the pain like he always did. Shinsou bursted into a pained smile. I'm jealous, though. That must mean that you're the real deal. He grit his teeth to push through the thoughts of pain, stepping forward. Thanks to my quirk's nature, I couldn't enter the Golden Gates. Shinsou stepped forward to match him. You wouldn't get that. You're naturally blessed. He shut his eyes painfully tight. He did get it. He knew exactly how Shinsou felt. UA had always been his dream, but it never would have been a reality without Gami or Ishihara or everyone else who'd laid the groundwork for his future. But still, Shinsou was right. He was blessed. You people, born with your awesome quirks, getting to follow your dreams. He was blessed by the people in his life. Midori rushed forward, closing the gap between them with surprising speed. Caught off guard, Shinsou wildly swung his elbow out, trying to bash him in the head, but with rapid assessment he pivoted on his back foot, dodged the swing entirely, countering with a thrust to Shinsou's shoulders to push him off balance. Shinsou staggered back, trying to recover with another wild jab to his face. Say something already! But he hadn't managed to bring his stance back to firmness, and Midori took advantage of that, wholeheartedly, yanking down on his outstretched arm. Shinsou's inexperience showed as he stumbled forward, almost crashing into Midoriya, but his momentum was used against him as Midoriya locked his grip around his arm. He didn't even register the feeling of skin on skin, feeling nothing but the urge to satiate the beastly fire that raged inside of him. Midoriya let out a cry that shook the heavens, heaving Shinsou around and over his head with inhuman strength, sending him tumbling. Straight out of the ring. Shinsou is out of the ring! Midnight announced with a wave of her hand, stepping forward from her spot on the sidelines next to Cementos. Midoriya caught his breath, staring down at the other as he watched his face scrunch up with disappointment. Midori Izuku moves on to the second round. The audience roared with applause at the first battle, regardless of how truly uneventful it was, but Midori didn't move, simply watching Shinsou as he rose from the dirt to face him. He bowed out of courtesy, but the other just turned away from him in disdain. He knew he should have just left it at that, but his bleeding heart wouldn't let him. The second I got my quirk, all I wanted to do was use it to help people. Shinsou stopped in his tracks. Having started to exit the arena, he turned his head ever so slightly, like he was waiting on more, because Shinsou was waiting for more. He knew that feeling, knowing exactly what he needed to hear, but being unable to ask. It seemed that many people knew it as well. I was blinded by my childhood naivety for so long that it wasn't until I actually made it to UA's hero course that it hit me. He looked away, and instead up toward the stands filled with countless worthier heroes, his classmates in training. I didn't belong here. His whispered admission was smothered by the deafening chatter and cheers from the audience, but it was just loud enough for the person steps away. My quirk could never help people. It was too dangerous, too innately evil. How could I ever help people, make anyone feel safe, when all they ever did is see death in my hands? He looked down at his hands, which he had unconsciously cradled again from the pain still shaking from the raw power emitted. He curled them up tight, digging his trembling fingers into his palms. People like me weren't meant to be heroes. At that, the overflow of DT almost seemed to lessen, like it no longer wanted him in pain because it heard what it wanted to hear, and maybe in another time he would have truly believed it for the rest of his miserable life, locking himself away from everyone and everything he loved in a misguided attempt to protect them. You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. But I was wrong. There's no meant to be. I'm going to keep fighting for my dream because that's what I want to do. He let go of the tension he was holding, feeling the pain resurface in response, but if that's what it took to do the things he loved, to protect the people he cared about, then it was a necessary sacrifice, one he was more than willing to make. He would never give up, even if that was all his powers wanted him to do. A quirk is just that. A quirk. It's up to you how you want to use it. And he would use his to help people. His gaze hardened vividly to counter the cold stare that Shinsou was giving him from over his shoulder. His fears were unable to suppress the fierce determination as it leaked from him in waves, melting through the ice in the air. And despite the intensity of the atmosphere, he still found the effort to smile, however small it was. So if you really want to be a hero, Shinsou, then that's what you'll be. The other stared into him, almost looking straight through his very soul. And without a word in response, he walked off, leaving the arena, though Midori didn't miss the way that his classmates crowded around the stands by the exit, cheering for him as he left. Midori didn't miss the way that his classmates admired his performance, or the way that his quirk had heroes talking non-stop. And he was sure that Shinsou didn't miss it either. This was okay. It was going to take more than one conversation to change anyone. He knew that from Todoroki. He knew that from himself, so he would stay strong and stay there if Shinsou decided to come around. He would make sure that Shinsou never felt alone. Midoriya, finally feeling resigned, made his way out of the arena too, despite everything. He'd still won and was moving on to the second round. That was something to be proud of. He couldn't help but feel excited, and who could blame him? Midoriya. He turned his head to see Midnight, standing just off to the side, her flogger whip resting daintily on her hip. Recovery Girl wants to see you in her office. She sent him a sarcastic smirk. Don't keep her waiting. He nodded dumbly, and she sent him off with a wave of her hand. What did Recovery Girl want with him? He wasn't injured, though his still shaking hand said otherwise. He pushed away the thought, slinking down the tunnel and into the interior of the arena. He best get this done sooner rather than later. He didn't want to miss any of the other matches. Todoroki's was next, and he couldn't deny he was interested to see it in person. He was then suddenly glomped by a massive shadow, nearly sent him tumbling into a wall. You cannot keep scaring me like that. My old heart cannot take the shock like it used to. He laughed, pushing the ghost off of him. I don't know what you want me to tell you, that you don't really have a heart or that you're not old. No sympathy, I tell you. He spat sarcastically before shifting to a more serious tone. You are all right? Yeah, I'm good. I mean, Recovery Girl wants to see me, but it's not that I got injured during my match. He cocked his head to the side in dismissal, but Kami wasn't convinced. It is impossible to hear anything from the stands that's not mic'd, but it seemed as if Shinsou was saying some hurtful things to you. Midori's gaze shifted to match his head. Well, he did, and while I won't deny that what he said hurt me, I don't want those things to hurt me anymore. Kami sighed. You are far too forgiving for your own good. I wouldn't call myself forgiving, he huffed, recalling how resentful he used to be and even still was. Just ready to move on, I guess. They drifted into silence, drifting down the halls until they reached Recovery Girl's temporary office. Upon reaching the door, he gave it a quiet knock, unsure if she still had anyone else inside, but upon the muffled approval that echoed back, he slid the door open, and Gami followed close behind. "Ah, dearie." Recovery Girl swiveled around in her oversized chair. "Good to see you. Come in." Midori scratched the back of his neck awkwardly, but otherwise entered as told, gently shutting the door behind him. "What did you need me for?" She scooted up closer, gesturing at the seat in front of her. "Sit down. I can see your hands shaking from here." He subconsciously drew his arms closer to his chest, protectively. "It's fine. I'd rather not lose any unnecessary stamina." But Gami gave him a nudge forward. "You did not tell me." "I didn't want to worry you." He turned to his mentor and then promptly away in shame. "It's not that big of a deal anyway." "I'll be the judge of that." She beckoned him forward again, and this time, though mostly at the behest of Gami, he sat. Recovery Girl reached out her hands, and Midori warily outstretched his own for her to take. He nearly yanked them back to safety as she slipped off his gloves, but the cool, undead touch from his mentor kept them gently in place. His bare hands trembled unconsciously, though not as violently as before. She rubbed her thumb softly into his palms as she inspected them thoroughly. "If I were to make an educated guess," the nurse mumbled, "this looks to be the beginnings of nerve damage. The shaking would probably stop on its own after a couple of hours, but any damage, no matter how small, would be naturally irreparable." She then leaned in, kissing one of his hands. Instantly it stopped shaking, and full control returned to him. He raised the hand closer to his face as she healed the other. Nerve damage. He guessed that made sense, though. Shock waves were extremely dangerous to the human body, and he figured he had gotten away with firing them at a distance with his scythe, but straight from his hand simply didn't give him the range to stay unhurt. But the festival was so far, it showed him how desperately he needed a few new means of non-lethal combat as well as another source of maneuverability, and right now he saw these blasts as the answer to both. "Thank you," he muttered as she wrapped both his hands in light bandaging before putting his gloves back on for him. "You didn't have to." "It's my job, dearie." She paused, suddenly looking a little dejected. "In fact, I'm more concerned that I'm not doing enough." "What? I mean, I'm fine." He furrowed his brows. "My power practically heals me itself, plus it doesn't really have any downsides that harm me, the perks of it not being a quirk, I guess." "That is not an excuse to be overwhelmingly reckless." She tapped him sternly on the head before settling down. "And it's the kind of thinking that worries me." Recovery Girl hopped off her chair, shuffling over to get her cane. "None of us know the full extent of what your abilities introduce, not only yourself, but on the people around you." She reached to grab the giant syringe from against the wall. "I bet not even Gami knows, as knowledgeable as he may be." He looked over to the ghost, who ducked in a personal shame. "It is true. Even now my memories escape me." "Todoroki can produce massive amounts of ice and fire, but his body suffers internal overload. Bakugo contains levels of firepower nearly unheard of for such an age, but his explosions put terrible amounts of strain on his body. Power is always sought after, but people neglect the truth that it comes with a price." She made her way back to him, tapping his knee lightly with the tip of her cane. "Even gifts have their consequences." A sickening shudder ran down Gami's spine, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread, nearly sending him clawing to find his very soul. But as soon as it washed over him, it was gone without a trace, and try as he might, he couldn't find its origins. Sensing she might have crossed a line, she backed away, leaving him to his space. "I apologize. It's my duty to keep every student safe and healthy, and sometimes I forget how overbearing I can be when doing that. You're good to go." Midoriya stood up swiftly. Making a beeline to the door, he reached out to leave but hesitated, realizing in his discomfort he was becoming insensitive. He turned back to face her, mustering up a smile. It was small but genuine. "Thank you again for healing my hands." He chuckled to himself. "I'll try not to end up here next round." "You better not, dearie." Recovery Girl waved her cane in mock aggression. "Now go enjoy the rest of the matches." He left, shutting the door behind him softly. Once he was a good couple steps away, he let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, staring down at his hands. She was right. He really didn't know what went on below the surface of his skin, as much as he fooled himself into thinking so. All this time, it was certainly possible he had less control than he'd thought, and that was terrifying. He clenched his hands tightly, the anxiety of the unknown creeping back to him like a demented dog, and then another set of hands moved to take his, a pleasant chill seeping from one set of bones to another. We shall figure it out together, whatever it may be. He glanced up at Gami, his head cleanly reset from the state before. He would find control to help him live alongside the fear. Yeah, he suddenly realized how much time he'd eaten away lounging around. We're gonna miss Shoto's match. Come on. He yanked his mentor into a run, scurrying down the hallway like overactive mice. They were lucky not to encounter anyone on their way back, both to avoid the extra time wasted as well as the questions asked. They made it to the Class A section of the stands, and Midori let go of Gami's hand as they slowed to a walk. Hey, good job, Uraraka whispered excitedly. We saved you a seat, Ida pointed beside him. The match is about to start. His heart warmed for the thoughtfulness as he sat down quietly next to Ida. He really had made it just in time, just able to make out two figures entering the arena from opposite sides. Impressing us so far with his maneuverability and quick reaction time, it's Sero Hanta from the Hero Course. He could see Sero crack his knuckles like he had during the match, but it came off way cooler than his own. Versus. But when he looked over to Todoroki, all he could feel was this overwhelming sense of sadness radiating from him. He glanced slyly over to his mentor, but by his nod, he knew the other had seen it too. He's been dominating this festival since the start. It's Todoroki Shoto of the Hero Course. The two stared each other down as midnight had counted down. Midori watched with a mix of both excitement and nervousness, fiddling with one of his gloves at the edge of his seat already as the heroine started the match. Sero seemed to stretch playfully, almost taunting the other to take the first move, before shooting out two streams of tape from his elbows. It wrapped around Todoroki instantly, binding his arms and legs together. With a quick tug, Sero had detached one of the strands from himself, then used the other to try and swing Todoroki right out of bounds. The complete lack of emotion from Todoroki, more so than usual, should have had Midori more worried. But if he wasn't before, he sure was now, watching Sero pull along a seemingly lifeless corpse. And then an explosion of ice ruptured from Todoroki's body, traveling straight through the tape into Sero, and then far past him, toward the stands, right at where they were sitting. "Watch out!" He jumped up, ripping off the glove that he was fiddling with before, and stretching his bandaged hand outwards. The decay exploded through his bandages and out of his fingertips, disintegrating the massive shards of ice upon contact. He had unconsciously positioned himself in front of his friends, shielding them with only his body in case he couldn't stop the ice in time. But that wasn't necessary, as the piece of enormous glacier had been heading toward them was turned to dust almost instantly. But his DT could only work so fast with such a small surface area like his fingertips, and so while he was fast enough to protect his friends and classmates, he wasn't able to escape unharmed. He retracted his hand, wincing at the small nicks and cuts that covered the sides of his fingers and palm. The bandages were absolutely shredded, falling off in shambles. He used what was left of them to dab away at the slight beads of blood that threatened to peek through. Sero is immobilized. Todoroki Shoto moves on to the second round. Chants of "good try" had echoed from the audience at Sero's overwhelming defeat, but lost amid those cheers. Midori couldn't help but see that same sadness from before that made his heart ache. He was going to help Todoroki no matter what. By the hurt in his heart, he promised. "Midori!" Ida exclaimed. "Your hand!" He closed it into a fist, hiding his injuries from sight. "I'm good. It doesn't even hurt." Uraraka looked skeptical. "Recovery Girl could heal that pretty easily for you." "I already went to her earlier. No need to bother her again." He sat back down, wiping the hand and any specks of blood onto his sweatpants in one swift motion. "Trust me. I'll manage." His friends didn't push the subject any further, both sitting back resigned. The on-staff heroes finished melting away the glacier that Todoroki left behind from his fight, and after a few minutes of cleaning and clearing, the arena was ready for the next match. He reached over to the side, picking out his notebook that he had left with Ida and a pencil from his pocket. He didn't get the chance to start during Todoroki's match because of how tight on time he'd arrived, but he was excited to start now. They watched Kaminari walk out to the arena. His classmates murmured enthusiastically about their electrified peer, and Midori stayed quiet. Not that he wasn't excited, but he already had notes on all of his classmates. He was more eager to see Kaminari's opponent. Another student, named Shiozaki by present mic, gracefully walked out, her vines rustling in the slight breeze. Even at this far distance, he had sketched out a brief silhouette, especially making sure to accentuate her hair. As the match began, he muttered to himself at light speed, his hands moving even faster as he absorbed the content of the fight faster than he could register it. About the way Shiozaki's vines had twisted from her head and enlarged, about the way that they rapidly spread onto the ground and around her, about the way that she ended the match in an instant. Oh yeah, the match was already over. A short-circuited Kaminari hung limply from her vines, with Shiozaki hiding behind a wall of her plants. She had easily been able to shield herself from his initial shock, since her vines negated the electricity and retained instantaneously by binding him for the immobilization. Midoriya was in awe. That would definitely teach him never to underestimate anyone. He hadn't even noticed that Ida had left to prepare for his match up next. "Your match just ended, but you're already thinking ahead," Uraraka laughed, and that's when he remembered he wasn't exactly alone. Well, not really," he stuttered in embarrassment, growing even redder at hearing Gami laugh behind him. "This is just a hobby of mine. I really like analyzing quirks, and with the festival I can really see some of the other quirks outside of our class." He flipped through his book with a wide, innocent smile. "I've already got everyone in Class A in here, even you, Uraraka." She giggled, but it didn't sound right, causing him to look up from his notes at her strained smile. "Midori, I thought you were amazing since the day we met, but since the sports festival, you've gone to a whole other level." She then looked off to the side almost sadly. Midori cocked his head confused, but the hitch in his throat prevented him from saying anything back. "The fastest student on his feet is Ida Tenya of the Hero Course." The next match was already starting, drawing the teen with an alluring grasp. He watched his friend enter the arena. What was he wearing? Versus another figure, also decked out in what looked like support gear, walked in from the other side, which definitely explained a lot. Covered head to toe in support gear, it's Hatsume Mei of the support course. Yep, classic Hatsume. Oh goodness, Gami sighed. Is she the reason he's wearing support gear without an application? Midori huffed his signal for probably. With his gloves, Nezu had written him up an application before the festival even started. It was really considerate of the principal, which had left Midori wondering what he had to do in return. But Nezu had insisted it was just the obvious choice, since he already was deathly attached to the indestructible gloves, though he just presumed that this was all to butter him up for having to speak during the festival. Ida, on the other hand, likely had no such an application even existed. And so whatever Hatsume was planning, it was likely as sadistic as she could be on this occasion. Would it be wrong to admit that he was excited to see this unfold? It seemed, despite Ida's lack of application, he was permitted to continue with the match with his equipped items, and with a wave of Midnight's whip, the match began. "What an incredible speed, Ida!" Wait, was that Hatsume's voice? Over the speakers, he doubted UA's staff would really give her a microphone for this fight. Did she make one herself? And if so, that didn't explain how she found the right frequency to use in the first place. Ida raced towards her, but she dodged with ease, using one of her many inventions, tripping him in the process. He pivoted back around instantly, again using one of Hatsume's inventions to do so. He raced toward her again, but to no avail, this time being caught in a motion sensor's capture net. This game of tag continued, and for nearly 10 whole minutes, their match became a play-by-play for a sales pitch. "A born saleswoman," Gami commented. "I like her." Midori turned to his friend slowly, hissing under his breath. "I mean, I like Hatsume too, but this has got to be considered cruel and unusual somewhere." Finally, after what seemed like ages, Hatsume stepped out of the ring, having shown off all of her current inventions, leaving Ida to just move on to the second round. The entire class, including Midoriya's sweat dropped, watching their strict and honor-bound class president shout at Hatsume for deceiving him, his voice so loud it carried into the stands without even a microphone. "Ida's just too serious," Midori remarked as he set down his notebook in his lap. It was way too easy to trick him into playing her game. "I do not know. I kind of admire that." He huffed, side-eyeing his mentor. "Ida's honor or Hatsume's underhandedness?" "Both, if I'm being honest. They remind me of—" Uraraka suddenly stood up, bumping past Midori in a hurry. "Sorry, I gotta get to the prep room." He watched her leave, noticing the lack of her usual cheerfulness in the air. Looking back to her seat, he realized she'd left her drink behind. Still practically full to the brim, he frowned. Was something wrong? He shook it off, scooting a little closer to Gami, who'd floated himself lower to try and sit next to him, only to manage levitating right above the seat. Most of his classmates weren't in the stands anymore, since they made up a majority of the 16 contestants in these one-on-ones. Because of that, Midori was allowed a little more freedom to talk to himself. "You were saying?" But Gami waved him off. "It is nothing. I do not remember anyways." Midori tried to watch the next couple matches, Ashido against Aoyama, which resulted in the male's pitiful beatdown as he expected. He remembered being excited to see Tokiyami and Dark Shadow in a one-on-one scenario, but he couldn't find that spark anymore, watching blankly as he and his partner easily bested Yaoyorozu without much of a fight. Kirishima and some of the Class B student with an eerily similar quirk were duking it out in the field right now, but despite the intensity of their fistfight, he just didn't have it in him to enjoy it anymore, his mind continuously traveling back to one bubbly girl. "I'm really worried about Uraraka. She seems so down compared to usual," he muttered, fidgeting with his gloves. "I don't know if I did something wrong, or—" "I would think it has something to do with her match against Bakugo next," Midoriya sputtered, catching himself before he riled up into a stir from his classmates. And when were you going to tell me this?" Gami shrugged, backing away slightly. "I presumed you already knew. It was on the screen with the rest of the matches, after all." The teen stood up quickly, startling the remainder of his classmates still left in the stands currently, and stuffed his notebook into the elastic of his sweatpants before rushing back to the arena interior, his mentor close behind as always. "I wasn't paying attention. Ugh, I must have seemed so insensitive." Gami wiggled one hand side to side, struggling to keep up with his racing successor. "It could have been worse." "You're not helping." They skidded to a turn, nearly running straight into a wall before arriving at the prep room. He didn't even take a moment to catch his breath, bursting into the room without warning. "Uraraka!" Ida was already inside, but still neither of them were expecting a third guest. Uraraka stumbled at the outburst, shooting up from her seat. "Midori, shouldn't you be watching the other matches?" He waved his hands wildly in dismissal. "I saw another too. They were short anyway. It's fine." Uraraka looked down at her hands. "So, I'm up soon?" Ida turned to him now. "I can't imagine Bakugo would give his explosive all against a female opponent." "No, he will." Midori responded a lot less tactfully than it sounded in his head. He could hear Gami facepalm behind him. I mean, everyone's competing here with the dream of becoming #1. I doubt anyone would hold back, least of all Bakugo." He turned away for a moment, pulling out the notebook he'd hastily grabbed along with him. You've helped me so much, Uraraka. I don't know how I could ever repay you." He was so lucky to have her, to have everyone in his life that he did. He'd never be able to thank them enough, not in his infinite lifetime. "But I thought I'd at least try and return the favor." He held out his notebook. It was relatively new, one he'd picked up toward the beginning of the school year to take notes about all his classmates' quirks. It had his signature titling on it, too, Hero Analysis for the Future, number 14. You need a counter-strategy for Bakugo, one that uses your quirks. I don't have anything about his quirk in here, but I've definitely got some theoretical strategies for non-offensive quirks against him, and I can fill in the rest of the missing information by memory. He was going to take care of all the people who'd taken care of him, an everlasting hero, an eternal one. He was never going to go away. He would always be there, for them and for everyone. He would make sure that Uraraka never felt alone. "Oh!" Ida exclaimed. "How fortunate for you, Uraraka." But she wasn't as overjoyed as he thought she'd be, pressing her fingers together. "Thanks, Midori, but—" Her face was painted with a warm smile, soft and delicate, something he'd never thought he'd see from such a cheery, overexcited girl. "It's okay." "Huh?" He wasn't expecting that, his head caught completely off guard and without a filter. "You're amazing, Midori. You do amazing things all the time." She hunched over the table, using her hands to prop herself up. "During the cavalry battle, I thought the easiest strategy would be to team up with friends," she admitted. "But when you think about it, I was actually just putting my faith in you." She curled her fingers into the table. "That's why Ida challenged you, and all that." Uraraka pushed away the chair for good this time, standing up straight now. "That left me feeling a little embarrassed about myself." Midoriya's heartbeat echoed in his ears, bringing his notebook back down to his side. He had no idea that this was what Uraraka was feeling all this time, and it left him feeling a little lost in how to help, because he wanted to, but he didn't know how. "That's why—" "Thanks, but no thanks." She pushed past them, a little roughly, heading for the prep room exit with her hands balled into fists. "Everyone here is fighting for their futures, so doesn't that make us all rivals?" It was that rivalry feeling again, and maybe this time Midoriya understood it more. Maybe it wasn't as frivolous as he thought it was, because at first all he was seeing was that he wanted to help, and it was being pushed away, just like with Todoroki, with Ida during the cavalry battle, and now here, but maybe it wasn't as cold and thoughtless as he thought it was. Maybe it was that he'd left such a big impact on them, they wanted to prove themselves to him too. Maybe it was because of his desire to care and help them. Maybe he was giving himself too much credit. Who knew, really? But just before she left, she looked back at them, raising a hand to send a shaky thumbs up. Her lips curled into a nervous smile, but even that couldn't hide the fire in her eyes. That's why I'll see you guys in the finals. She then started to slide open the door, but Midoriya couldn't stop himself from reaching out to her. She'd done so much for him. She'd been his first friend here at UA. She'd made him feel welcome. She'd always helped him feel more confident in himself. He was lucky. He was really lucky. He always had been. She stopped when he touched her shoulder, turning around in shock. Everyone was caught off guard, really, including Midoriya. He'd never been the type to initiate physical contact, and yet here he was, surprising himself. Like a wise man once told me. He smiled into a firm nod, hoping that was enough to tell her just how important she was to him. Do kick ass. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 33 of Deku and Death. Chapter 34 will be next. I hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.